This is the second and final video for the key works of Egyptian art. We're starting off by looking at the Mortuary temple of Hatshepsut because we'll be looking at a sculpture that represents her that was actually destroyed in just a minute. That's one of your key works. Hatshepsut was a particularly exceptional pharaoh because she was a woman. And so her mortuary temple reflects her power. It's quite large. It's this temple over here. She was originally named regent for her stepson, Thutmose III, so presumably she was intended to rule until he reached his majority, and then she would step aside. This did not happen, however. She seems to have taken control and ruled from 1473 to 1458 BCE. So the location of this mortuary temple is farther south, Deir el-Bahri, further south in Egypt, indicating that in the New Kingdom you see a number of structures, monuments, and the capital itself moving farther south in what we would consider to be Upper Egypt. Hatshepsut's mummy has been recently discovered, or at least archaeologists hope that they've found her mummy, because her stepson, once he became pharaoh, carried out a campaign of trying to destroy her memory or any claims that she made to being pharaoh or king. Her mummy may have been hidden away in the tomb of her nurse. So they found a mummy that's extraordinarily well preserved, and there are a few key archaeological findings that connect the mummy that we see here to her original coffin, but unfortunately we cannot know for sure if this is actually Hatshepsut, but that's a recent archaeological discovery. The key work that we're focusing on is Hatshepsut with offering jars from the upper court of her mortuary temple, so the upper area of the temple that was the first slide of this video. So what we see here is a work made out of red granite. It's currently in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. It's quite substantial in size, over 8 feet tall, and if you look closely you can see that it's all fragmented, broken up into tiny little pieces, which reflects the fact that once Thutmose III became pharaoh, he did destroy a lot of Hatshepsut's memory through the destruction of her artworks. As we can see from this work of art, she really did take on more of the appearance of a man in her artwork, probably as a way to ensure or to reassure her people that she was powerful enough and strong enough to rule. She wears the same kind of headdress that we saw previously with earlier pharaohs from the Old Kingdom. She has the false beard, even though she's a woman, and she's holding onto 2 offering jars here, and also kneeling. The offering jars and the kneeling pose are things that a pharaoh would only do when making offerings to the gods or to the divine. So a pharaoh would never kneel to anyone but to a god. So this shows us that she has this sculpture that puts her in a position of perpetual offerings or perpetual gifts to the gods. This is the temple of Amun-Ra in Karnak in Egypt. This is also from an area further south in Egypt. This entire complex takes up hundreds of acres. You can see it's enclosed. It would have been a restricted area primarily for priests. Also the pharaoh could presumably enter, especially because the pharaohs were often the primary patrons of this site. Some of the site does survive. We have some columns and remnants of the structures, but most of it does not survive as it looks in this reconstruction. So I show you the reconstruction so you can see the temple of Amun-Ra at center here, and you can also see the sacred lake here, which refers back to the creation story from the waters of the Egyptians. So the stories began in the first waters or the early waters, and then land came from those waters. So presumably this structure recreates the creation story of the Egyptians. And so we'll focus in on the structure here, the temple to Amun-Ra. You can see there's a number of pylons or gateways that one would have to go through, plus pylons on either side of the temple itself. A number of pharaohs contributed to this, so Hatshepsut, also Thutmose III, Thutmose I, Ramses, and Seti later on. A recent project that's been undertaken at UCLA is to do a digital reconstruction of Karnak because it did change so much over a long period of time. This reconstruction project is called Digital Karnak. It allows you to enter into places like the Temple of Amun-Ra here. And here's where Karnak is located on the map of Egypt. So you can see that it is farther down the Nile than Giza, which is up here. This is a reconstruction of the hypostyle hall. Hypostyle hall is a hall where columns support the roof. Remember, we're in a period of post and lintel type construction, so you want to make sure that all the columns are relatively close together so that the roof remains fully supported. And another invention here, in addition to having all the to have this type of hypostyle hall, which we see in other examples in Egypt, we also have the clear story, which are these windows along either side, which allow light to enter in. So light would come through in either direction. This temple otherwise would be quite dark. It was dark. If you see reconstructions through the Digital Karnak project at UCLA, you'll see that it still was a relatively dark structure, but you needed that light, or this source of light would have been very important. So by having these slightly taller, or actually quite a bit taller columns in the center, and then shorter columns on the side, this creates a space for windows or for grates so that light can enter in. And this is just to give you a sense of the scale. Look how small human figures are at the base here. And this is just a view so you can see some of the pylons on either side of the temple. On these columns, these are how the columns look today and how the site itself survives the temple. And you can see a person off to the side here. The columns look very natural. They look like a flowering plant up at the top. So often we see these columns as reflections of what artists and architects were seeing in the natural world. So we believe that a lot of these architectural forms originated in what was seen in nature, which is not unusual. We have what's called sunken relief, so rather than carving in traditional relief style where you would reveal the figures by carving around them, these actually are sunken into the columns to preserve the bulging shape of the column on either side. Otherwise, if you carved in the traditional fashion, it would look very bumpy along the side. So sunken relief provides a more consistent look on the outer portion of the column. Moving on, you can see by looking at the temple complex that we were just looking at in Karnak that the priests and that the religion in Egypt was becoming extremely powerful, that they likely controlled a lot of the resources, that the priests themselves were probably becoming very powerful. So we see this dramatic change to a more monotheistic system. And we see this with a pharaoh called Akhenaten. He worships a god called the Aten, which is a disk, a single sun disk. So we see a portrait of Akhenaten, and Akhenaten means he who is of service to Aten. So he's referring through his name back to this new god, or this new important figure in the Egyptian theology that he is now controlling, that he's in charge of. We also see a dramatic change in the artistic style in this period. So as you can see from this figure, very curvy type hips, almost looking like a female figure, a slightly kind of slack belly or bulging belly, more narrow shoulders, an elongated face. So there's been a number of questions as to what's going on here in terms of the artistic style. Is it just a break from the past, so a new style indicating a new religion? Or is it some kind of disorder that Akhenaten suffered from that's being celebrated here? Some people have put that idea forth. But most likely there's just a deliberate artistic change to reflect this new belief system. Akhenaten also founded a new capital, so it's called Akhenaten, which is a site called Amarna. So this is often referred to as the Amarna style. Akhenaten means the horizon of Aten. So everything began to be renamed for this new sun disk, this new god. Previously, everything had been named for Amun, and now everything's for Aten. So here you can see that. His original name meant Amun is satisfied, but of course he had to change it due to this new religion. The key work here is Akhenaten represented with his wife Nefertiti, meaning beautiful one has come, and their 3 daughters. You can see they also have these very kind of curvy hips, very elongated heads. The 3 daughters have almost egg-shaped heads, And you can see they're in an outdoor pavilion. It looks quite pleasurable. They have wine carafes over here, or holders of wine or some type of liquid. But most importantly, you have that Aten up here, that sun disk. So the new gods don't take the forms of animals or humans, but the form of a disk. And so the idea that Akhenaten would have represented himself as almost genderless, as having both female and male characteristics, may also refer back to this Aten, this disk that seemed to lack a sex. And you can see the sun rays providing kind of health or life. You can see they're holding the symbol of life in Egypt. And so these are being offered to Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their 3 daughters. And you can see they're clearly figures of status, sitting on thrones, their feet elevated. The last key pharaoh to focus in on is, of course, Tutankhamen, who's known in popular culture as King Tut. His tomb is relatively modest. He died probably unexpectedly at a very young age, at 18, after ruling for about a decade. So he became pharaoh very young, and he also died very young. He did a couple of important things. The religion was changed back to the original pantheon of gods, or original group of gods. So he abandoned the worship of the Aten, and he also, because he died rather suddenly, has this relatively modest tomb that seems to have been put together very quickly, and is the only tomb to have been found in such complete shape. It had been robbed a couple of times, but most of the large, substantial things in his tomb were still there, including his coffin, and including a lot of other objects that give us a sense of how rich some of these tombs would have been for pharaohs who ruled for even longer than King Tut. At first, people thought maybe he was murdered. They suspected foul play because he did die so young. But recent archaeology, or recent, DNA analysis, or analysis of his mummy, indicates that it was possibly malaria that killed him, which was a much more common illness and is much more exciting than murder. A key work that I want to show, most people do know his mask and things like that, but the key work that I want to focus in on is the throne that we see here. We see him looking quite young here, seated on a throne with a footstool, just like the one we see here. Just like Khafre's, it has lions on either side, symbols of authority and power, but it continues to have that Aten sun disk here. So we see some continuity in terms of iconography, but we do see his young wife off to the side, and her name includes the word Amun. So we know that they've returned to this new, or to the previous religion, the older religion, and they've abandoned, or seemingly abandoned, the new religion. However, some of that iconography does continue. And finally, if we look down at the footstool, you can see that we have bound captives. So this is this portion of the footstool. We have bound captives, which very literally would show how powerful King Tutankhamen was by placing his feet directly on these captives. And of course, Tutankhamen's name also includes a reference to that previous god, Amun, right here. So both his wife and Tutankhamen refer back to that earlier god. They seem to have left the Aten behind, with the exception of a little bit of iconography left on the throne itself. So that's the conclusion of the New Kingdom. The next video will be on the Near East.